father's love became a bloodbath, and the walls still remember the screaming. Some men don't just break, they detonate, taking entire families into the grave with them. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters, where the stories get darker and the truth cuts deeper. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're diving into 4 chilling stories you don't want to miss. If you enjoy these late-night truths, please like, comment, and subscribe. It helps the channel grow and keeps these stories alive. This is the story of the devil who wore a smile, the Fernando Eros Caro massacre. Now, relax, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. We're tracking a predator who lived inside the family home, who kissed his children goodnight before planning their execution, who wore the mask of devotion while sharpening the blade of annihilation. Fernando Eros Caro didn't just murder. He orchestrated a symphony of suffering so calculated, so merciless, that investigators would later describe the crime scene as hell materialized. This is the story of a man who weaponized trust, who turned sanctuary into slaughterhouse, and who proved that sometimes the most dangerous monster is the one sleeping beside you. Fernando Eros Caro moved through life like a shadow wearing human skin, unremarkable to most, invisible to many, yet concealing something venomous beneath the surface of his carefully constructed existence. To neighbors in their quiet residential enclave, he appeared as just another working father navigating the exhausting machinery of modern life, another face in the endless parade of commuters and weekend lawnmowers who populated their tree-lined streets. But normalcy, as we've learned time and again, makes for the most effective camouflage. The Caro household existed in that peculiar space between stability and dysfunction that defines so many American families. Bills paid on time, children enrolled in local schools, a mortgage steadily diminishing, Christmas lights hung with seasonal precision. From the outside, everything suggested a family operating within acceptable parameters of suburban contentment. Colleagues at Fernando's workplace described him as quiet, competent, unremarkable in his consistency. He arrived punctually, completed his assignments without fanfare, rarely participated in office politics or social gatherings. The kind of employee who blends into the corporate wallpaper, neither distinguished nor troublesome, existing in that vast middle ground of professional mediocrity. Yet those who claim to have known Fernando more intimately, a designation that seems almost laughable given what would eventually unfold, speak of something else entirely. They describe a man of peculiar rigidity, someone whose need for control manifested in subtle but unmistakable ways. Household routines followed with military precision. Meals consumed at exact times. Children's activities monitored with suffocating attention. His wife's movements tracked, questioned, accounted for with the meticulous paranoia of a man convinced the world conspired against him. This obsessive need for dominion extended beyond mere scheduling and into the psychological architecture of family dynamics. Fernando demanded absolute authority in every decision, from trivial matters of daily routine to significant choices about education, finances, and social relationships. Disagreement was not discussed. It was crushed, often with verbal brutality that left psychological scars far deeper than any physical wound. Family members learned quickly that peace came through submission, that questioning Fernando's judgment invited storms of rage that could last for days. Friends who occasionally visited the Caro residence noted the peculiar tension that permeated the household, children who spoke in careful, measured tones, a wife whose smiles never quite reached her eyes, an atmosphere of performance rather than authentic family warmth. Conversations felt scripted, as though everyone had rehearsed their lines before guests arrived. Laughter, when it occurred, sounded hollow, mechanical, the social equivalent of a music box grinding through its predetermined melody. Fernando's relationship with his wife had deteriorated into something resembling a Cold War, two nations sharing borders but communicating only through ultimatums and tactical silence. What affection might have once existed had calcified into resentment, obligation, and mutual contempt poorly disguised as marital endurance. She had become, in his warped perception, simultaneously an extension of his will and a constant source of betrayal, a paradox that fueled his growing paranoia and rage. The children existed in a state of perpetual anxiety, never certain which version of their father would emerge from his bedroom each morning. The occasionally affectionate figure who might play board games or help with homework, or the tyrant whose unpredictable eruptions of anger sent them scattering like frightened animals. They learned to read his moods through subtle cues. The set of his jaw, the rhythm of his breathing, the particular way he gripped his coffee cup. Survival meant becoming amateur psychologists, constantly assessing threat levels and adjusting their behavior accordingly. Financial pressures had been mounting steadily, adding accelerant to an already volatile situation. Fernando's income, once sufficient for the family's needs, had become increasingly inadequate as expenses multiplied and economic realities shifted. He viewed this financial strain not as circumstance but as personal failure, another piece of evidence in his growing conviction that the universe had singled him out for special punishment. His wife's occasional suggestions about returning to work or adjusting their lifestyle triggered explosive confrontations about respect, duty, and his role as provider. In the months preceding the massacre, those who interacted with Fernando noted a disturbing shift in his demeanor. The careful mask he'd maintained began showing cracks. He spoke obsessively about perceived injustices, slights at work, imagined conspiracies among neighbors, the conviction that his family failed to appreciate his sacrifices. Conversations spiraled into paranoid monologues about betrayal and ingratitude. His eyes, once merely cold, began carrying something darker, a kind of empty fury that suggested internal calculations too terrible to articulate. He stopped maintaining basic self-care routines. His appearance grew increasingly disheveled. Sleep patterns disintegrated. He would spend hours staring at nothing, lost in whatever nightmarish fantasies were taking shape inside his fracturing mind. When family members attempted to express concern, he interpreted their worry as further evidence of disrespect, more fuel for the rage engine grinding constantly in his psyche. The psychological architecture of family annihilators, men who murder their entire families, follows predictable patterns that Fernando embodied with textbook precision. These killers typically view their families not as autonomous individuals but as extensions of themselves, possessions over which they exercise absolute ownership. When circumstances threaten their control, financial collapse, divorce, public humiliation, they cannot tolerate the idea of their possessions existing beyond their dominion. Destruction becomes preferable to loss of control. Fernando had begun researching methods, though investigators would only discover this digital trail after the carnage. His browser history revealed searches about firearms, about quick deaths versus prolonged suffering, about crime scene investigation techniques. He was planning, calculating, preparing for an act so monstrous that even contemplating it should have triggered every alarm bell evolution installed in the human conscience. But Fernando's conscience, if it had ever truly existed, had been systematically dismantled by his narcissism, his rage, and his absolute conviction that he had been wronged beyond redemption. His wife had begun making quiet inquiries about separation, confiding in a close friend that she could no longer tolerate the psychological abuse, the suffocating control, the complete absence of affection or partnership. She was gathering documents, opening a separate bank account, researching family law attorneys. She was preparing to escape, not realizing that her husband was preparing something far more permanent. The family had become a powder keg, and Fernando held the match with steady, calculated hands. Every interaction, every ordinary moment of those final weeks was occurring in the shadow of approaching horror that only he could see. His children attended school, completed homework, argued over television privileges, completely unaware that their father was no longer planning their future. He was planning their annihilation. When neighbors later reflected on those final days, they recalled nothing particularly alarming, no screaming arguments or obvious signs of crisis. Just the Caro family going through their usual routines, existing in their usual state of quiet dysfunction that characterized so many households on their street. Normalcy as camouflage, routine as concealment, the mundane rhythms of suburban life masking the approach of something unspeakable. The night Fernando Eros Caro transformed from controlling father into mass murderer arrived without warning, without dramatic escalation, without the kind of obvious trigger that might have allowed someone to intervene. It was an evening like countless others before it. Dinner consumed in tense silence, children retreating to bedrooms for homework and screen time, his wife cleaning the kitchen with the mechanical efficiency of someone performing a task they'd repeated 10,000 times. Normalcy stretched across the household like a thin membrane, beneath which something catastrophic was preparing to erupt. Fernando moved through the evening's rituals with unusual calm, a serenity that would later strike investigators as deeply unsettling. He had crossed some internal threshold, made whatever final psychological calculations justified what he was about to do, and achieved the terrible peace that comes from absolute commitment to monstrous action. His decision had been made. The debate was over. Now came only execution. He waited until the house settled into its nighttime rhythms. Children in bedrooms, wife in the master bathroom preparing for bed, the sounds of running water and closing doors signaling the family's transition into vulnerable unconsciousness. This was the window he had been calculating, the moment when his victims would be separated, distracted, incapable of mounting coordinated resistance or escape. He retrieved the weapon he had acquired weeks earlier, purchased legally and stored with careful concealment, and began his methodical progression through the house. The first victim never saw him coming, never had a moment to comprehend what was happening before the weapon discharged and consciousness ended in an explosion of violence and incomprehension. Fernando had chosen this sequence deliberately, neutralizing the family members most capable of resistance first, creating conditions where the remaining victims would be isolated and terrorized. He was executing a military-style operation, eliminating threats in order of priority with cold tactical efficiency. The sound of gunfire shattered the household's fragile peace, transforming ordinary domestic space into a killing ground in the span of heartbeats. Confusion erupted. Family members processing the impossible, trying to reconcile the sound of violence with their supposedly safe environment, those crucial seconds of disbelief that prevented immediate flight or defensive action. By the time comprehension arrived, Fernando was already moving to his next target. He progressed through the house with deliberate purpose, checking rooms systematically, ensuring no one escaped his calculated purge. Children who had been consumed with homework or video games moments earlier now found themselves facing their father as executioner, their developing minds completely unprepared to process this ultimate betrayal. The man who had taught them to ride bicycles, who had attended their school plays, who represented their primary model of masculinity and protection, had become the source of their annihilation. The terror those children experienced in their final moments defies adequate description. The cognitive dissonance of seeing a trusted parent transformed into a killing machine, the animal panic of mortal danger combined with the psychological devastation of ultimate betrayal. They screamed for mercy from someone incapable of providing it, begged for their lives from someone who had already decided their existence was forfeit. Their pleas fell on ears deafened by rage, narcissism, and whatever psychological fractures had convinced Fernando that murder represented a solution rather than a horror. His wife, hearing the chaos unfolding, made desperate attempts to intervene, to protect the children, to somehow stop the nightmare consuming her family. She confronted Fernando, pleaded with him, attempted to reason with someone who had abandoned reason entirely. Their final confrontation played out with the terrible intimacy of two people who had shared years of life together. Her desperate appeals to memory, to love, to basic humanity met with his cold determination to eliminate what he could no longer control. The weapon discharged again and again. Each shot another life extinguished, another future erased, another human being with dreams and fears and potential reduced to meat and memory in the span between heartbeats. Fernando moved through his family with the systematic efficiency of someone completing a checklist, ensuring thoroughness, preventing survival. He was not killing in passion or frenzy. This was execution, calculated and methodical. The house, which had contained living, breathing human beings engaged in the ordinary business of existence just minutes earlier, now held only corpses and the man who created them. Fernando stood amid the carnage he had manufactured, surrounded by the bodies of people who had trusted him, depended on him, carried his DNA and his name. The silence that followed the gunfire was absolute. No more crying, no more pleading, no more sounds of life. Just the ringing echoes of violence and the ragged breathing of a mass murderer surveying his work. What thoughts passed through Fernando's mind in those moments remains unknowable. Did he feel satisfaction at having reasserted control? Did horror at what he'd done begin penetrating his rage? Did he experience the existential vertigo of someone who has just severed all connections to humanity and normal existence? Whatever internal state he occupied, it did not produce remorse sufficient to stop him from completing his plan. He had determined that he would not face consequences, would not endure arrest and trial and imprisonment. The final victim would be himself, the ultimate expression of his narcissistic conviction that life beyond his control was life not worth living. He positioned himself carefully, made whatever final mental preparations such an act requires, and pulled the trigger one last time. The weapon discharged. Fernando Eros Caro collapsed among the family members he had slaughtered, adding his own corpse to the collection, transforming the household into a tomb containing the entirety of a family line extinguished in a single night of calculated brutality. Neighbors heard nothing unusual. The house's walls contained the sounds of massacre, prevented the screams from traveling beyond the property line. The neighborhood continued its evening routines. Televisions broadcasting sitcoms, people walking dogs, teenagers texting friends, completely unaware that meters away, an entire family had been annihilated. This is the terrible truth about suburban violence. It can occur in complete isolation, hidden behind walls and doors, and the assumption that normalcy prevails until proven otherwise. The bodies would remain undiscovered until the following day, when concerned relatives unable to reach the family by phone requested a welfare check. Police officers approaching the residence anticipated perhaps a medical emergency or family out of town forgetting to inform anyone. Nothing in their training or experience prepared them adequately for what awaited inside. A crime scene so saturated with violence and death that even veteran investigators would require counseling afterward. The door was unlocked. Fernando's final act had been ensuring his crimes would be discovered, that investigators would find the evidence of his ultimate expression of control. Officers entering called out, announcing their presence, following protocol. Silence answered. They progressed deeper into the house, noting details that suggested recent habitation. Dishes in the sink, lights left on, televisions paused mid-program. Then they found the first body, and then the second, and third. Each discovery adding another layer of horror to an already nightmarish situation. The scene suggested systematic execution rather than frenzied attack. Bodies positioned in ways indicating they'd been hunted down, found where they'd attempted to hide or make final desperate stands. The house had become a murder maze, each room potentially containing another victim, another testament to Fernando's methodical brutality. Investigators documented everything with grim professionalism, photographing angles, collecting evidence, reconstructing the sequence of killing. The physical evidence told a clear story: premeditated family annihilation followed by suicide, a murder-suicide scenario depressingly common in domestic violence cases that escalate to ultimate extremes. But knowing the category doesn't diminish the horror of the specific, doesn't make the bodies any less dead or the crime any less monstrous. News of the Caro family massacre detonated across the community like a psychological bomb, shattering assumptions about safety, normalcy, and the trustworthiness of neighbors who smile and wave from their driveways. Within hours, media descended on the quiet residential street, transforming it into a circus of cameras, reporters, and horrified onlookers drawn by the gravitational pull of catastrophic tragedy. The house became ground zero for collective trauma, a physical location now forever associated with unspeakable violence. Neighbors struggled to reconcile the horror with their memories of the Caro family, those ordinary people they'd exchanged pleasantries with at mailboxes, whose children had played in the same parks, who had seemed utterly unremarkable right up until they became victims and perpetrator in a mass killing. How does one process such radical discontinuity? How do you integrate the knowledge that meters from where your own children sleep, an entire family was systematically executed by the person meant to protect them? The psychological impact rippled outward in concentric circles of trauma. Immediate neighbors reported sleeplessness, anxiety, and paranoid vigilance about their own family members. If Fernando Caro could transform from ordinary father into family annihilator, who else might be concealing similar potential for violence? The massacre shattered the illusion of predictability, forcing everyone to confront the terrible randomness of suburban horror and the impossibility of truly knowing what occurs behind closed doors. Children who attended school with the Caro kids required counseling to process the loss of classmates and friends to such incomprehensible violence. Teachers struggled to explain the unexplainable, to provide comfort while their own understanding of the world had been destabilized. How do you tell a child that their friend's father murdered them? How do you maintain any sense of security or justice when such complete betrayal is possible? The investigation proceeded with methodical thoroughness, though the basic facts were never in dispute. Fernando had murdered his family and then himself. The physical evidence, the weapon, the sequence of events all confirmed what the scene suggested immediately. But investigators sought to understand context, to map the psychological terrain that produces family annihilators, to identify whether warning signs had been missed or intervention points existed where this tragedy might have been prevented. They interviewed Fernando's colleagues, who described his recent deterioration. The paranoid comments, the rants about betrayal and disrespect, the visible mental decline that should have triggered concern but instead was dismissed as personal problems or midlife crisis. Several co-workers admitted they'd found Fernando's behavior troubling but hadn't known what to do with their vague unease. Who report someone for seeming angry and stressed? Those descriptors fit millions of people who never commit violence. His wife's friends provided crucial context about the abuse she'd endured, the psychological control, the verbal brutality, the suffocating surveillance of her activities and relationships. She had been planning to leave, had confided her fears about Fernando's reaction to separation, had worried about his capacity for violence, but hadn't anticipated this level of calculated massacre. She'd been gathering resources, preparing her exit, trying to protect herself and her children from a man she'd finally recognized as dangerous. Her preparations had been too slow. Domestic violence experts weighed in with grim familiarity, noting that Fernando Caro fit the profile of family annihilators with depressing precision. These killers share common characteristics: narcissism, need for absolute control, inability to tolerate loss or public failure, tendency to view family members as possessions rather than autonomous individuals. When circumstances threaten their control, impending divorce, financial collapse, public humiliation, they choose destruction over loss of dominion. Murder-suicide becomes, in their warped logic, preferable to allowing their family to exist beyond their authority. The most dangerous period for domestic violence victims is when they attempt to leave. Separation represents the ultimate loss of control for abusers, triggering their most extreme and violent responses. Fernando's wife had been navigating this treacherous transition, trying to extract herself and her children from his control without triggering catastrophic retaliation. She had failed not through lack of caution, but because Fernando's determination to destroy what he could not control exceeded her ability to escape. Investigators discovered Fernando's digital footprint, searches about murder weapons, about crime scene investigation, about family annihilators and their motivations. He had been researching his own intended crime category, studying previous cases, perhaps seeking validation or methodology. His browser history revealed a mind consumed with planning violence while maintaining sufficient functionality to appear normal to colleagues and casual acquaintances. The mask had held until the moment he decided to remove it permanently. Financial records showed mounting pressures, debts accumulating, income insufficient for expenses, the slow-motion collapse that accompanies many family annihilation cases. Fernando had viewed his financial struggles as personal failure rather than circumstantial challenge, another piece of evidence in his persecution narrative. His inability to provide adequately for his family had become, in his distorted perception, justification for eliminating them rather than enduring the humiliation of reduced circumstances or accepting his wife's offers to contribute income. Extended family members emerged from shock into the devastating work of arranging funerals, settling estates, and attempting to understand how someone from their family line could commit such atrocity. They oscillated between grief for the victims and complicated feelings about Fernando, mourning the person they thought they knew while recognizing he had been concealing something monstrous. How do you grieve someone who murdered the people you loved? How do you reconcile fond memories with ultimate betrayal? The community organized vigils and memorials for the victims, carefully excluding Fernando from commemorations. He had forfeited any right to public mourning through his actions. The victims were remembered as individuals with distinct personalities, dreams, and potential, not merely as statistics in a murder-suicide case, but as human beings whose lives mattered and whose deaths represented incalculable loss. Children spoke about their lost classmates. Friends shared memories. Teachers described bright students whose futures had been stolen by paternal violence. Mental health professionals offered analysis about recognizing warning signs and intervention strategies, though their expertise carried the hollow quality that accompanies all post-tragedy recommendations. Could this have been prevented? Perhaps, if the right person had noticed the right combination of warning signs and taken action despite the difficulty of intervening in families that appear functional from outside. But prevention requires resources, awareness, and willingness to act on incomplete information, all of which remain frustratingly inadequate across most communities. The house itself became a problem requiring solution. No one wanted to live in a space so thoroughly saturated with violent death. It sat empty for months, crime scene tape removed but the building's history preventing sale. Eventually, a property developer purchased it at significant discount with plans for complete demolition and reconstruction. Even physical spaces can be contaminated beyond redemption by the horrors they've contained. Legal proceedings were mercifully brief, with Fernando dead by his own hand. There was no criminal trial, no lengthy court process forcing survivors to relive trauma repeatedly. His estate was settled with assets distributed to more distant relatives, as immediate family had been entirely eliminated. Insurance policies initially refused payment based on murder-suicide clauses, leading to legal disputes that dragged on for years, adding financial stress to the emotional devastation experienced by surviving family members. Some neighbors moved away, unable to continue living in proximity to such horror. Others stayed but reported fundamental changes in how they experienced their community. Hypervigilance about neighbors' behavior, increased security measures, persistent anxiety that undermined their previous sense of safety. The massacre had rewritten the neighborhood story, transforming it from anonymous suburban enclave into that place where the family murder happened. Media interest eventually waned, as it always does, moving on to fresher tragedies and more current horrors. The Caro family massacre became historical rather than immediate, reduced to a case file and occasional true crime retrospective. But for those directly impacted, surviving family members, witnesses to the aftermath, children who lost classmates, the trauma continued, woven permanently into their psychological architecture. Domestic violence organizations used the case as grim educational opportunity, highlighting the warning signs Fernando had displayed and emphasizing resources available to people trapped in abusive relationships. If even one person recognized their own situation in Fernando's pattern and sought help before violence escalated, perhaps some small meaning could be extracted from senseless tragedy. But such rational frameworks provide little comfort to those mourning specific, irreplaceable human beings murdered by someone who claimed to love them. Understanding Fernando Eros Caro requires confronting uncomfortable truths about masculinity, control, and the construction of family annihilators. He was not an anomaly or inexplicable aberration. He represented the extreme end of a continuum that includes millions of men who struggle with rage, entitlement, and inability to process loss of control without resorting to violence. What made Fernando different was not the presence of these traits, but his willingness to act on them with absolute commitment. Family annihilators emerge from specific psychological soil. Narcissistic personality structures, authoritarian belief systems, and deep-seated conviction that family members exist primarily as extensions of the patriarchs will rather than autonomous individuals deserving respect and agency. Fernando embodied these characteristics completely. His wife and children were, in his perception, possessions over which he exercised rightful dominion. When circumstances threatened that dominion, destruction became preferable to loss. The psychology driving such men is simultaneously comprehensible and alien to most people. We can trace the logic. Perceived loss of control triggers existential crisis. Inability to tolerate failure or public humiliation produces desperate measures. Distorted thinking patterns convince them that murder represents a solution rather than an additional horror. But understanding the psychological mechanics doesn't make the actions any less monstrous or the victims any less murdered. Fernando's violence didn't emerge spontaneously. It resulted from years of accumulating rage, resentment, and entitlement that corroded whatever capacity for empathy and connection he might have once possessed. Every small act of control, every instance of psychological abuse, every moment of treating his family as objects rather than people moved him incrementally closer to the threshold he eventually crossed. The massacre was not an isolated event, but the culmination of a process, the final expression of patterns established long before. Research on family annihilators reveals disturbing patterns. These killers are overwhelmingly male, typically between ages 35 and 55, often facing financial or relationship crises that threaten their sense of identity and status. They view their families through the lens of ownership, my wife, my children, with possessive pronouns reflecting possessive psychology. The idea that these people might exist independently, might thrive without them, or even prefer life without their presence, becomes intolerable. Many family annihilators, like Fernando, carefully plan their crimes rather than acting impulsively. They research methods, select weapons, choose timing to maximize their ability to kill every family member without interruption or escape. This premeditation reveals the calculated nature of their violence. This is not passion or temporary insanity, but deliberate choice to commit mass murder against people who trusted them completely. The aftermath of such crimes forces communities to confront the mythology of the family as inherently safe space. We construct cultural narratives about home as sanctuary, family as protection, parents as protectors. Family annihilation cases shatter these comforting fictions, revealing that the most dangerous threats often originate from within rather than outside the family structure. The person statistically most likely to kill you is someone you love and trust, an uncomfortable reality that undermines foundational assumptions about safety and predictability. Fernando's suicide following the murders represents a common pattern among family annihilators. Having destroyed what they claimed to love, having eliminated the family they allegedly sought to protect, they choose death over facing consequences. This final act of violence, self-murder, completes their expression of absolute control. They determine not only who lives and dies, but also deny society the opportunity for justice, trial, or accountability. Even in death, they exercise dominion. Some psychological frameworks attempt to generate sympathy for family annihilators by emphasizing their mental health struggles, financial pressures, or childhood traumas. While understanding contributing factors matters for prevention, we must resist the urge to transform perpetrators into victims. Fernando made choices to abuse rather than respect, to control rather than partner, to murder rather than accept the dissolution of his marriage. His circumstances may have been difficult, but millions of men face similar pressures without committing mass murder. The specific brutality of family annihilation, the intimate betrayal, the calculated nature of the violence, the targeting of children, places these crimes in a unique category of horror. Fernando didn't kill strangers or distant acquaintances. He murdered people who depended on him for survival, who had no reason to anticipate violence from their primary protector. He weaponized their trust, used their love and dependency as tools to ensure their vulnerability. Children victimized by family annihilators experience particular tragedy. They die confused, terrified, unable to comprehend why the person meant to protect them has become their executioner. Their developing brains lack frameworks for processing such complete betrayal. They die calling for mercy from someone incapable of providing it, experiencing terror amplified by cognitive dissonance. This represents perhaps the cruelest dimension of Fernando's crime, the psychological torture preceding death. His wife endured years of psychological abuse before dying violently at his hands. She recognized the danger, was actively planning escape, taking steps to protect herself and her children. She did everything domestic violence experts recommend, confiding in friends, gathering resources, planning carefully. She failed not through lack of caution, but because Fernando's determination to destroy what he couldn't control exceeded her ability to escape. Her death represents the tragic limitation of intervention strategies when confronting someone committed to violence. Community members struggle to reconcile the Fernando they thought they knew with the monster he revealed himself to be. This cognitive dissonance plagues survivors of such crimes. How could we not know? How did we miss the signs? Were there indicators we failed to recognize? This self-questioning, while natural, often misdirects focus from perpetrator to community, transforming observers into inadvertent accomplices through their supposed failure to intervene. The reality is that men like Fernando work hard to maintain public personas that conceal their private monstrousness. They compartmentalize effectively, presenting acceptable faces to colleagues and acquaintances while reserving their true selves for family members who lack power to escape or expose them. This deliberate performance makes detection difficult. The mask is intentional, carefully maintained, designed to prevent intervention until violence becomes inevitable. Preventing future family annihilations requires confronting uncomfortable realities about masculinity, power, and family structures. We must abandon narratives that treat men's violence as natural or inevitable response to stress. We must recognize that domestic abuse often escalates to homicide, that controlling behavior predicts future violence, that men who view family members as possessions represent serious threats, requiring intervention rather than privacy. Fernando's crime also highlights the inadequacy of mental health resources and intervention systems. Multiple people recognized his deterioration, his paranoid thinking, his concerning behavior. Yet mechanisms for compelling treatment or removing weapons from dangerous individuals remain frustratingly inadequate. The gap between recognizing danger and preventing violence remains wide, filled with legal obstacles, resource limitations, and cultural resistance to intervention in family matters. The case forces examination of how we construct and reinforce toxic masculinity. The belief systems that equate manhood with control, dominance, and inability to tolerate perceived failure or disrespect. Fernando internalized these messages completely. His identity required absolute authority within his family. When circumstances undermined that authority, his sense of self disintegrated, replaced by rage and determination to destroy what he could no longer dominate. We cannot understand family annihilators without confronting the cultural soil that produces them. The messages about male entitlement, the normalization of controlling behavior in relationships, the insufficient consequences for domestic violence, the tendency to excuse men's rage while demanding women manage it. Fernando existed within these larger systems, drew from these cultural resources to justify his actions, operated according to logic our society partly enables. Yet ultimately, despite all psychological and sociological analysis, we must acknowledge the core truth. Fernando Eros Caro chose to murder his family. He had alternatives: divorce, therapy, acceptance of changed circumstances. He rejected every option except violence. Whatever factors contributed to his psychology or circumstances, the decision to commit mass murder remained his alone. He bears responsibility for transforming from father into executioner, from protector into annihilator. The families he destroyed deserved life, safety, and opportunity to flourish. His children deserve to grow up, experience love and achievement, contribute their unique gifts to the world. His wife deserved freedom from abuse, chance at happiness beyond his control, dignity and autonomy he denied her. Fernando stole all possibilities, erased all futures, extinguished multiple human beings to satisfy his narcissistic need for ultimate dominion. The Fernando Eros Caro case stands as testament to the darkest potentials of intimate relationships, the terrible consequences of unchecked narcissism and rage, and the urgent necessity of treating domestic violence as the lethal threat it represents. His name now belongs to the grim catalog of family annihilators. Men who chose destruction over loss, who murdered love rather than release control, who proved that sometimes the monster doesn't invade from outside but emerges from within the family itself. We study cases like this not to sensationalize or exploit tragedy, but to extract whatever knowledge might prevent future horrors. If understanding Fernando's psychology helps identify similar patterns in others before violence erupts, if his crimes motivate enhanced domestic violence intervention, if his victim stories inspire even one person trapped in abuse to seek help, then perhaps some microscopic meaning can be found in otherwise senseless carnage. But mostly, the case reminds us of permanent truths. That normalcy can conceal monstrousness, that families are not always safe, that control taken to extreme becomes annihilation, and that some men, when faced with loss of dominion, choose to destroy everything rather than accept their own humanity and limitation. Fernando Eros Caro became a monster not because monsters are born, but because he embraced monstrous choices, step by calculated step, until nothing human remained. Only rage, entitlement, and the smoking weapon that ended multiple lives and destroyed whatever love might once have existed in the household he transformed into a tomb. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Double Life Predator. When your neighbor is hunting. A father figure by day. A calculating predator when darkness fell. Nobody suspected the man next door was collecting trophies from the innocent. In Port Stephens, Australia, one man's carefully constructed facade of normalcy concealed a chilling reality. Children weren't safe, even in their own beds. We're tracking a monster who wore the perfect disguise. A friendly neighbor, a trusted community member, a man who smiled while plotting his next move. Stephen David Catlin didn't lurk in shadows or hide in abandoned buildings. He operated in plain sight, embedding himself into the lives of families, gaining trust, accessing vulnerability. This predator understood something terrifying. The best hunting ground isn't a dark alley. It's the comfortable familiarity of everyday life. What makes this case particularly disturbing isn't just what he did, but how long he operated undetected, how many warnings were missed, and how easily evil can wear an ordinary face. Port Stephens, New South Wales. A coastal paradise where families felt secure, where neighbors knew each other's names, where children played without fear. The community thrived on trust, on the unspoken agreement that people looked out for one another. Stephen David Catlin understood this trust intimately. He studied it, weaponized it, turned it into his most effective tool. Catlin presented himself as unremarkable, middle-aged, soft-spoken, helpful, the kind of person who'd offer to watch your kids while you ran errands. The kind of neighbor who'd wave from his driveway, make small talk about the weather, volunteer at community events. His ordinariness was deliberate, carefully cultivated. He'd learned that predators who stand out get caught. Blending in meant access. Access meant opportunity. Opportunity meant victims. His residence became a landmark of sorts in the neighborhood. Not because it looked sinister, but precisely because it didn't. Well-maintained lawn, friendly dog in the yard, curtains that matched the suburban aesthetic. Nothing about the exterior suggested the horrific violations occurring within those walls. This disconnect between appearance and reality represents one of the most unsettling aspects of predatory behavior. The ability to compartmentalize, to maintain dual identities so completely that even those closest to the perpetrator remain oblivious. Catlin's method was patient, methodical. He didn't snatch children off streets or force his way into homes. Instead, he infiltrated lives gradually, establishing himself as trustworthy, reliable, safe. He attended neighborhood gatherings, participated in local activities, created relationships with families. Parents saw him as harmless, perhaps even beneficial, an extra set of eyes watching over the community's children. This perception gave him something invaluable: unsupervised access. The psychology behind his approach reveals a sophisticated understanding of human behavior. Catlin recognized that parents are naturally protective but also practical. They need babysitters, carpools, emergency contacts. They want to believe their community is safe, that their neighbors are good people. He exploited this optimism ruthlessly. Every friendly conversation, every helpful gesture, every display of normalcy reinforced the illusion. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, he was documenting his crimes, collecting evidence of violations that would eventually expose the monster beneath the mask. Technology played a disturbing role in Catlin's offending pattern. He didn't just assault children. He recorded these assaults, creating permanent documentation of trauma. These recordings served multiple purposes for him: personal gratification, potential trading material within predator networks, and trophies commemorating his power over vulnerable victims. The existence of such material compounds the horror exponentially. Each image, each video represents not just a moment of abuse but an ongoing violation, potentially circulated among countless offenders, re-traumatizing victims indefinitely. His victim selection demonstrated calculated predation. Catlin targeted children within his social sphere, kids whose families trusted him, who'd been taught he was safe, who had no reason to fear him. This betrayal of trust inflicts psychological damage that extends far beyond the physical violations. These children had to reconcile the friendly neighbor they knew with the person who hurt them. Their sense of safety, their ability to trust, their understanding of the world, all shattered by someone who should have protected them. The grooming process Catlin employed is textbook predatory behavior, yet terrifyingly effective. He'd identify vulnerable children, perhaps those from single-parent households, kids seeking attention, families experiencing stress. He'd offer help, become indispensable, create situations where he'd be alone with potential victims. Gradually, he'd test boundaries: inappropriate comments disguised as jokes, accidental physical contact, exposure to sexual content framed as education. Each step normalized the abnormal, confused the child's understanding of appropriate behavior, made them question their own instincts. Neighbors later reported seeing nothing unusual. Children came and went from Catlin's property. He'd be outside washing his car, tending his garden, looking entirely ordinary. This cognitive dissonance, the inability to connect the mundane reality they observed with the horrific truth, demonstrates how effectively predators can manipulate perception. People don't want to believe evil exists in familiar places. This reluctance to suspect becomes the predator's greatest advantage. The duration of Catlin's offending remains one of the case's most chilling aspects. He didn't commit isolated incidents. He maintained an ongoing pattern of abuse over an extended period. Each day that passed represented another opportunity for intervention missed, another child potentially victimized, another moment when the community's trust in him remained intact while he violated that trust behind closed doors. His digital footprint would eventually prove his undoing, but for years, Catlin maintained operational security that kept authorities unaware. He understood technology well enough to store and organize his illicit material, to potentially connect with other offenders, to maintain his crimes while presenting a clean public face. This technical competence made him more dangerous, more capable of sustaining his predatory behavior without detection. The families living around Catlin had no idea they'd positioned their children within striking distance of a calculating predator. Birthday parties, school pickups, casual afternoon visits. All these normal interactions provided cover for something sinister. Parents kissed their kids goodnight, believing them safe, unaware that a trusted neighbor was systematically violating children who should have been protected. What transforms this case from tragic to truly horrifying is the realization that Catlin's facade could have continued indefinitely. He made no obvious mistakes, raised no red flags, triggered no suspicions. His exposure came not from behavioral slips but from investigative work that finally pierced the carefully maintained illusion. Without that intervention, how much longer would he have operated? How many more children would have suffered? These questions haunt everyone connected to the case. The community's eventual reckoning with Catlin's true nature would force difficult conversations about trust, vigilance, and the uncomfortable reality that evil doesn't always announce itself. It hides in plain sight, wears familiar faces, speaks in friendly tones. Understanding this doesn't mean succumbing to paranoia. It means recognizing that protection requires both trust and verification, both community connection and appropriate caution. Detective work in child exploitation cases demands navigating through darkness that most people never imagine exists. Officers involved in these investigations view humanity at its absolute worst, processing evidence that proves how depraved some individuals become. The investigation into Stephen David Catlin began not with a dramatic arrest but with digital breadcrumbs, traces of activity that suggested someone in Port Stephens was accessing, creating, or distributing child exploitation material. Australian federal police officers trained in cybercrime detection noticed patterns in online activity originating from the region. Specific IP addresses showed repeated access to known child exploitation networks. Digital forensics teams began methodically tracing these connections, building cases with the painstaking attention to detail required for successful prosecution. Every piece of evidence needed documentation, verification, chain of custody maintenance. Mistakes could mean guilty predators walking free on technicalities. The trail led investigators toward Catlin's residence, though initially they had no idea who lived there or what they'd find. Search warrant applications required demonstrating probable cause, showing judges sufficient evidence to justify invading someone's privacy. Investigators compiled their findings. Repeated suspicious activity, connections to known offender networks, patterns consistent with child exploitation material possession. Judges reviewed the evidence and authorized the search. Executing search warrants in these cases requires careful planning. Officers must secure the premises quickly to prevent evidence destruction. Suspects often maintain material on devices that can be wiped clean in seconds if they realize police are approaching. Teams coordinated their entry, ensuring Catlin couldn't delete files, destroy hard drives, or eliminate the evidence that would prove his crimes. The moment officers entered Catlin's residence, the facade shattered completely. What they discovered confirmed their worst suspicions and revealed the extent of his predatory behavior. Multiple devices, computers, external drives, cameras, contained vast quantities of child exploitation material. But this wasn't just downloaded content from the internet. Catlin had produced original material, documenting his own offenses against children within his community. Forensic examination of seized devices is methodical, exhaustive work. Specialists recover deleted files, trace internet activity, catalog every piece of evidence. In Catlin's case, they found thousands of images and videos. Each file represented a crime, a violated child, a moment of trauma captured permanently. The volume of material indicated sustained, prolific offending over considerable time. This wasn't experimentation or curiosity, it was systematic predation. Particularly disturbing were the recordings Catlin himself had created. These showed identifiable locations within his residence, proving he'd used his home as a crime scene. Investigators recognized furniture, room layouts, distinctive features that matched the property they'd searched. This self-produced material provided irrefutable evidence of hands-on offending, not merely possession of contraband downloaded from elsewhere. Identifying victims became a priority alongside building the prosecution case. Every child appearing in Catlin's self-produced material needed identification, support, protection. Investigators worked with specialists trained in victim identification, examining backgrounds, clothing, any details that might help determine who these children were and whether they remained at risk. Some victims were located and provided with support services. Others remain unidentified, their suffering documented but their current circumstances unknown. The investigation revealed Catlin's connections to broader offender networks. He wasn't operating in isolation but as part of a community, a horrifying reality of modern child exploitation. Online networks allow predators to share material, exchange techniques, normalize their behavior through interaction with like-minded offenders. These networks operate in encrypted spaces, hidden forums, dark web locations designed to evade law enforcement detection. Catlin's communications with other offenders showed him discussing his crimes, sharing advice, potentially trading material. This networking behavior demonstrates how technology has transformed child exploitation from isolated incidents to coordinated, interconnected offending. Breaking up these networks requires international cooperation, sophisticated technical capabilities, and relentless determination from law enforcement agencies. Interviewing Catlin presented its own challenges. Offenders in these cases often employ various strategies: complete denial, minimization, blaming victims, claiming addiction or compulsion. Experienced investigators know these tactics, prepare for them, structure interviews to break through deception. Evidence from Catlin's own devices made denial difficult, but that didn't prevent him from attempting to minimize his culpability. The psychological profile that emerged showed calculated predation rather than impulsive behavior. Catlin had groomed access to children deliberately, created opportunities systematically, documented his offenses methodically. This wasn't someone who'd made a single terrible mistake. It was someone who'd built an entire lifestyle around predation, who'd structured his life to facilitate ongoing abuse. Community members, learning of Catlin's arrest, experienced shock, disbelief, and horror. Parents whose children had interacted with him faced agonizing uncertainty. Had their kids been victimized? Had they unwittingly exposed their children to danger? These questions produced tremendous guilt, even though the fault lay entirely with Catlin. Predators exploit trust. That exploitation doesn't make trusting people culpable for being deceived. The investigation also examined Catlin's background for previous warning signs. Had there been earlier incidents, complaints, concerning behaviors that went unaddressed? This review serves both immediate case-building purposes and broader preventive goals. Understanding how predators evade detection helps develop better protective systems, improved screening procedures, more effective intervention strategies. Evidence collection extended beyond digital material to physical evidence from Catlin's residence. Investigators documented locations where abuse occurred, collected items that might contain DNA evidence, photographed layouts matching those seen in recorded material. Building the strongest possible case required connecting every piece of evidence to the defendant, eliminating any possibility of reasonable doubt. Prosecutors preparing the case against Catlin faced the challenge of presenting horrific evidence to juries without overwhelming them or violating court procedures regarding sensitive material. Legal strategies involved careful evidence selection, showing enough to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt without unnecessarily exposing additional people to traumatic content. Expert witnesses would testify about digital forensics, victim identification, predatory behavior patterns. The charging process reflected the severity and extent of Catlin's offending. Multiple counts covered different aspects of his crimes: production of child exploitation material, possession, distribution, contact offenses against identified victims. Each charge carried significant potential penalties, but more importantly, each represented acknowledgement of specific harms inflicted on specific children. Throughout the investigation, support services worked with identified victims and their families. Therapeutic intervention, legal advocacy, practical assistance, all became necessary to help these children and families navigate the aftermath of Catlin's predation. The trauma doesn't end when the offender is arrested. Healing requires sustained support, professional guidance, time. Law enforcement agencies involved in the case also had to manage their personnel's well-being. Officers and analysts working these investigations face vicarious trauma, viewing material that proves humanity's capacity for horrific behavior toward children. Departments must provide psychological support, debriefing, resources to help investigators process what they encounter professionally without carrying it into their personal lives. The courtroom became the stage where Stephen David Catlin's carefully constructed facade faced its final destruction. Legal proceedings in child exploitation cases follow strict protocols designed to protect victims while ensuring defendants receive fair trials. Balancing these competing interests requires skillful navigation of complex legal, ethical, and practical considerations. Catlin's defense team faced an unenviable task. Representing a client whose guilt appeared overwhelming, based on evidence seized from his own devices. Defense attorneys in these cases must ensure proper procedure was followed, that constitutional rights were protected, that evidence was legally obtained. Even guilty defendants deserve competent representation. This principle underpins the justice system's integrity. Prosecutors presented their case methodically, building a comprehensive picture of Catlin's predatory behavior. Digital forensic experts testified about evidence recovered from seized devices, explaining technical details in language jurors could understand. File creation dates showed sustained offending over years. Metadata confirmed Catlin's devices created the material, not just received it from external sources. Internet history revealed his activities within offender networks. Victims who'd been identified and were capable of testifying faced agonizing decisions about whether to do so. Testifying means reliving trauma, facing the person who hurt you, exposing painful experiences to public scrutiny. Support workers help these young people and their families understand the process, prepare for what testimony would entail, access therapeutic resources to manage the stress. Some victims provided testimony through special procedures designed to minimize additional trauma. Closed-circuit television allowed them to testify without being in the same physical space as Catlin. Victim impact statements could be submitted in writing, read by advocates, or delivered personally depending on what each victim felt capable of handling. These accommodations recognize that justice shouldn't require re-traumatization. The evidence was overwhelming. Catlin's own recordings provided irrefutable proof of contact offenses against children. The volume of material on his devices demonstrated sustained, prolific collecting and producing of child exploitation content. Communications with other offenders showed his active participation in predator networks. Investigators had built a case that left little room for reasonable doubt. Defense strategies in cases with such damning evidence often focus on mitigation rather than disputing guilt. Arguments might include claims of addiction, mental health issues, troubled background, anything that might persuade judges or juries toward leniency in sentencing. These arguments rarely succeed in significantly reducing penalties for serious child exploitation offenses, but defense attorneys must explore every avenue on their client's behalf. The trial proceedings revealed additional disturbing details about Catlin's offending. Prosecutors presented evidence of sophisticated concealment techniques he'd employed. Encrypted files, hidden folders, devices disguised as other electronics. This sophistication demonstrated consciousness of guilt, awareness that his activities were criminal, deliberate efforts to evade detection. Such evidence undermines any claim of ignorance or accidental wrongdoing. Expert witnesses provided context about child exploitation networks, explaining how offenders like Catlin connect globally to share material, validate their behavior, and collaborate in predation. These networks operate with surprising organization, using technology to evade law enforcement while facilitating ongoing abuse. Understanding this networked nature helps explain why breaking up these communities requires international cooperation and sustained effort. The psychological harm inflicted on Catlin's victims became a central focus during sentencing considerations. Expert testimony explained how childhood sexual abuse affects development, relationships, mental health, and overall well-being. These impacts aren't temporary or easily overcome. Many victims struggle throughout their lives with consequences of abuse they experienced years earlier. Catlin's actions had sentenced these children to potentially lifelong struggles with trauma's aftermath. Victim impact statements delivered during sentencing hearings provided powerful testimony to the real-world consequences of Catlin's crimes. Parents described watching their children struggle with nightmares, behavioral changes, difficulty trusting others. Young victims described feeling betrayed, violated, permanently changed by someone who should have been safe. These statements humanized what could otherwise become abstract legal proceedings, reminding everyone involved that behind each charge was a real child who'd suffered real harm. The judge presiding over Catlin's case faced the responsibility of imposing sentences that reflected the severity of his crimes while adhering to legal sentencing guidelines. Judges must consider numerous factors: offense severity, number of victims, defendant's criminal history, likelihood of reoffending, protection of the community, potential for rehabilitation. In cases involving extensive child exploitation and contact offenses, sentences tend toward the severe end of available ranges. Catlin received multiple sentences corresponding to different charges, with the court determining whether these would be served concurrently or consecutively. Consecutive sentences mean each penalty must be served in full after the previous one completes, resulting in much longer total imprisonment. Concurrent sentences allow multiple penalties to be served simultaneously, reducing total time incarcerated. Given the severity and volume of Catlin's offending, prosecutors advocated for consecutive sentences to ensure he remained imprisoned for maximum duration. The final sentence reflected judicial recognition that Catlin posed ongoing danger to children and had demonstrated through years of offending that he prioritized his own gratification over children's safety and well-being. Lengthy imprisonment served multiple purposes: punishment for crimes committed, protection of the community from future offending, and deterrence signaling to potential offenders that such behavior carries severe consequences. Beyond imprisonment, Catlin faced additional consequences designed to prevent future offending if ever released. Registration requirements would track his whereabouts indefinitely. Restrictions would limit his access to children, his internet use, his residence locations. These ongoing restrictions acknowledge that pedophilic interest doesn't disappear with imprisonment. Management strategies must continue post-release to protect potential victims. The broader community also faced consequences of Catlin's crimes. Trust that had seemed reasonable now appeared naive. Parents questioned their judgment, their ability to protect their children, their assessment of who constituted safe versus dangerous individuals. This collective trauma rippled through Port Stevens, affecting families who'd never directly encountered Catlin, but who now questioned their own vulnerability to similar predation. Support services expanded in the case's aftermath, recognizing that healing required more than just removing the offender. Counseling programs, educational initiatives about recognizing grooming behavior, community forums discussing child safety, all became part of the recovery process. These efforts aimed not to create paranoia, but to empower families with knowledge and resources to better protect children. Law enforcement agencies used the case as a learning opportunity, examining what worked in the investigation and what could improve. Techniques that successfully identified and prosecuted Catlin would be refined, shared with other agencies, incorporated into training programs. Every case advances collective understanding of how predators operate and how to stop them. Legal reforms sometimes follow high-profile cases, with legislators responding to public concern by strengthening laws, increasing penalties, or closing loopholes that allowed offending to continue. Whether Catlin's case would inspire such reforms remained to be seen, but advocates for child protection used it to illustrate ongoing needs for better prevention, detection, and prosecution of child exploitation. The international dimension of child exploitation requires global cooperation in investigation and prosecution. Catlin's connections to offshore offender networks meant his case involved agencies beyond Australia. Information sharing, coordinated operations, mutual legal assistance treaties. All these mechanisms enable authorities worldwide to combat predatory networks that transcend national boundaries. Technology companies also face pressure to better prevent their platforms from facilitating child exploitation. Encryption, privacy protections, and free speech considerations complicate efforts to monitor and prevent criminal activity, but ongoing dialogue seeks balance between legitimate privacy interests and child protection imperatives. Catlin's use of technology to commit and document crimes illustrated why this balance matters. The conclusion of Stephen David Catlin's trial marked not an ending but a transition into a long, difficult aftermath for everyone affected by his crimes. Justice had been served in the legal sense. Catlin was convicted, sentenced, imprisoned. Yet true justice for victims of child exploitation remains elusive. No sentence can undo the harm inflicted, erase traumatic memories, or restore innocence stolen. Victims of Catlin's abuse faced years of healing ahead. Childhood sexual abuse creates complex trauma that affects psychological development, relationship formation, self-perception, and overall mental health. Therapy helps, but healing isn't linear or quick. Survivors often experience setbacks, triggered memories, periods of intense difficulty alongside gradual improvement. Support systems, family, professionals, peer survivors, become crucial to navigating this challenging journey. Parents and families of victims carried their own trauma and guilt. Many tormented themselves with what-if questions. What if they'd been more vigilant? What if they'd questioned Caitlin's interest in children? What if they'd trusted their instincts when something felt slightly off? Therapists working with these families emphasized that predators like Caitlin are experts at deception. The fault lies entirely with the offender, not with people who extended normal, reasonable trust. The Port Stevens community underwent collective reckoning with uncomfortable truths. Evil had lived among them, undetected, for years. This realization challenged their sense of security and judgment. Community forums brought residents together to discuss child safety, share concerns, and develop stronger protective networks. These conversations, though difficult, helped rebuild communal bonds strained by Caitlin's betrayal. Educational initiatives expanded throughout the region following Caitlin's conviction. Schools implemented enhanced programs teaching children about body autonomy, appropriate versus inappropriate touch, and how to report uncomfortable situations. These programs walked a careful line between empowering children to protect themselves and avoiding fear-based messaging that might create anxiety disorders. Parents received education about grooming behaviors, red flags suggesting potential predation, and strategies for maintaining children's safety without inducing paranoia. This education emphasized that most people are trustworthy and good, but that appropriate vigilance and open communication with children provide crucial protective factors. Teaching children they can always talk to parents about anything, without fear of punishment or disbelief, creates safety nets that make successful predation more difficult. The case highlighted ongoing challenges in detecting and preventing child exploitation in the digital age. Technology enables predators to connect globally, access vast quantities of illegal material, and document their crimes with unprecedented ease. Yet this same technology provides law enforcement with powerful investigative tools, digital forensics, metadata analysis, network infiltration techniques. The arms race between predators' technical sophistication and law enforcement's capabilities continues evolving. Caitlin's extensive collection of self-produced material raised questions about when and how his offending began. Investigators believe many predators follow progression patterns. Initially viewing material produced by others, gradually becoming more involved in offender communities, eventually producing their own content through direct abuse. Understanding these progression patterns helps identify intervention points where potential offenders might be diverted before committing contact offenses. Treatment programs for sexual offenders generate considerable debate. Some argue that pedophilic interests cannot be changed, only managed, making lifelong supervision necessary. Others believe therapeutic interventions can reduce reoffending risk, particularly for less entrenched offenders. Caitlin's case, involving years of sophisticated, calculated predation, suggested someone unlikely to benefit from standard treatment programs. His risk to children would remain high even after decades of imprisonment. The question of where Caitlin would live after eventual release troubled community members. Sex offender registries and residence restrictions aim to prevent released offenders from living near schools, playgrounds, or other child-concentrated areas. Yet these policies create challenges. Where can registered offenders live without violating restrictions? How do communities balance safety concerns with constitutional rights? These difficult questions lack easy answers. Victim advocacy organizations used Caitlin's case to push for policy reforms. Advocates called for increased funding for investigation and prosecution of child exploitation cases, mandatory reporting requirements for suspicious online activity, enhanced victim support services, and stronger sentencing guidelines. These organizations work tirelessly to transform individual tragedies into systemic improvements that protect future children. The financial costs of cases like Caitlin's are substantial but necessary. Investigations require specialized personnel, expensive technology, extensive time. Prosecutions involve expert witnesses, complex evidence presentation, lengthy trials. Victim support services need sustained funding to provide effective long-term assistance. Despite these costs, societies must commit resources necessary to combat child exploitation effectively. International cooperation proved essential in Catlin's case and remains crucial for addressing global exploitation networks. Children abused anywhere in the world can have that abuse documented and distributed globally within moments. Breaking up these networks requires agencies from multiple nations working together, sharing intelligence, coordinating operations. Organizations like Interpol facilitate this cooperation, maintaining databases of child exploitation material and helping identify victims worldwide. The psychological toll on professionals working these cases deserves recognition. Police investigators, prosecutors, judges, forensic specialists, therapists, all encounter disturbing material and hear traumatic testimony regularly. Vicarious trauma affects these professionals' mental health, relationships, and worldview. Agencies must provide robust support systems, including counseling, peer support groups, rotation policies preventing excessive exposure, and organizational cultures that acknowledge the emotional difficulty of this work. Technology companies face pressure to better prevent their platforms from facilitating child exploitation. End-to-end encryption protects privacy but can also shield criminal activity from detection. Content moderation identifies and removes illegal material but requires human moderators to view horrific content. These companies must balance competing interests while contributing to child protection efforts. Many now employ sophisticated detection technologies, report suspicious activity to authorities, and cooperate with investigations while protecting user privacy where legitimate. The media's role in reporting cases like Catlin's requires careful consideration. Responsible reporting informs the public and raises awareness about child exploitation realities. Sensationalized coverage risks re-traumatizing victims, invading privacy, or inadvertently glamorizing offenders. Ethical journalism in this context means focusing on systemic issues and protective strategies rather than graphic details or offender-centric narratives. Survivors of childhood sexual abuse often become powerful advocates for prevention and support services. Their courage in speaking publicly about traumatic experiences helps break stigma, encourages other victims to seek help, and motivates societal action against exploitation. While no survivor should feel obligated to public advocacy, those who choose this path contribute invaluably to protective efforts. The case forced examination of how communities can better protect children without creating oppressive surveillance states or teaching children to fear all adults. This balance is delicate but essential. Children benefit from free play, community connection, and trusting relationships with caring adults. Creating environments where appropriate vigilance coexists with childhood freedom requires thoughtful approach, not knee-jerk reactions driven by fear. Long-term studies of child exploitation victims reveal patterns in how trauma affects development and adult functioning. Many survivors struggle with depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, substance abuse, and relationship difficulties. Yet many also demonstrate remarkable resilience, building fulfilling lives despite early trauma. Understanding factors that promote resilience helps shape support services to better assist victims in healing and thriving. Prevention efforts increasingly focus on potential offenders themselves, creating opportunities for people experiencing attraction to children to seek help before offending. Confidential therapeutic services allow these individuals to manage their attractions, develop coping strategies, and receive support without fear of prosecution for thoughts they haven't acted upon. This preventive approach remains controversial but represents recognition that stopping abuse before it begins protects more children than punishment after the fact. Catlin's imprisonment removed one predator from society, but thousands more operate in communities worldwide. Each case solved represents justice for specific victims but also highlights the vastness of the problem. Comprehensive approaches combining investigation, prosecution, prevention, education, and victim support offer the best hope for reducing child exploitation's prevalence. The legal system's handling of child exploitation cases continues evolving. Sentencing guidelines have generally increased over recent decades, reflecting societal recognition of these crimes' severity. Courtroom procedures have adapted to reduce victim re-traumatization. Evidence rules have adjusted to address digital content's unique characteristics. These improvements result from dedicated advocates pushing systems toward greater protection and justice for exploited children. Technology that enables exploitation can also empower protection. Apps help parents monitor children's online activity appropriately. Educational games teach safety concepts in age-appropriate ways. Reporting systems make flagging concerning behavior easier. Forensic tools help identify victims and track offenders. Continued innovation in protective technologies provides hope for future improvements in child safety. Stephen David Catlin's name joins a grim roster of predators whose cases remind us that protecting children requires constant vigilance, strong institutions, engaged communities, and unwavering commitment. His conviction represented justice delayed but ultimately achieved. The scars his victims carry will fade but never fully disappear. The community he betrayed slowly rebuilt trust and security. The systems that eventually stopped him continue refining methods to catch the next predator faster, protect the next potential victim better, and ensure that evil wearing ordinary faces cannot hide indefinitely. The work continues. For every predator caught, others remain undetected. For every victim identified and helped, others suffer in silence. The fight against child exploitation demands sustained effort, adequate resources, and societal commitment to prioritizing children's safety over convenience, privacy concerns over protection, or any other consideration. Stephen David Catlin's case serves as both victory, a predator stopped, victims vindicated, justice served, and reminder of how much work remains to be done. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Chandler Halderson Case. A son's love became a tomb of lies, and his parents never saw the chainsaw coming. What happens when the golden boy everyone believed in turns out to be the most dangerous predator in the room? We're diving into the mind of a master manipulator tonight, a young man who wore the mask of success so convincingly that even those closest to him never suspected the monster lurking beneath. But when his web of lies began to unravel, Chandler Halderson didn't just run from the truth. He obliterated it. And his parents paid the ultimate price for believing in their son. Chandler Halderson was the kind of son every parent dreams of raising. At 23 years old, he seemed to have it all figured out. He told his family he was attending Madison Area Technical College, pursuing a degree that would launch him into a promising career. He spoke with confidence about his internship at an insurance company, spinning tales of important projects and professional meetings that painted him as a rising star. His parents, Bart and Krista Halderson, beamed with pride whenever they spoke about their younger son. To them, Chandler represented everything they'd worked so hard to provide: opportunity, education, and a bright future. But every word was a fabrication. Chandler wasn't attending college. He had no internship. There were no important meetings, no professional projects, no career trajectory. The young man who seemed so put together was actually unemployed, spending his days in his childhood bedroom in Windsor, Wisconsin, constructing an elaborate fantasy world built entirely on deception. While his parents went to work each day, believing their son was building his future, Chandler was playing video games, browsing the internet, and meticulously maintaining the greatest lie of his life. The Halderson home was a comfortable split-level house in a quiet neighborhood where American flags hung from porches and neighbors knew each other by name. Bart Halderson, 64, worked as a financial analyst, a methodical man who believed in hard work and honesty. Krista, 53, was warm and nurturing, the kind of mother who still packed lunches and left encouraging notes. They had raised 2 sons in this house, and while their older son Mitchell had moved on to build his own life, they took comfort in Chandler's presence, proud of the man they thought he was becoming. Chandler's girlfriend, Catherine Mellender, also known as Kat, believed the stories too. He'd told her about his educational pursuits, his career ambitions, and his bright future. She had no reason to doubt him. Chandler was charming, attentive, and seemingly devoted to building a life with her. They talked about their future together, about the possibilities that lay ahead once Chandler completed his degree and established himself professionally. She loved him, trusted him, and never imagined that the person she was planning a future with didn't actually exist. The lies had started small, as they often do. Perhaps it began with a single class Chandler didn't want to attend, a test he wasn't prepared for, or a deadline he couldn't meet. But instead of confronting these challenges or admitting his struggles, he chose deception. And once that first lie was told, each subsequent fabrication became easier, the web growing more complex with every passing month. Chandler became a master architect of illusion, constructing such detailed false narratives that even those who lived with him never suspected the truth. He created fake emails from professors. He invented work supervisors who didn't exist. He fabricated stories about presentations and exams, internship responsibilities, and career opportunities. When his parents asked about school, he had answers ready, detailed, convincing answers that required increasingly elaborate backstories to maintain. The mental energy required to sustain such an extensive deception was staggering, but Chandler committed himself to it fully. Perhaps he believed he could somehow make it all true eventually, that he could find a way to transform his lies into reality before anyone discovered the truth. But reality has a way of catching up. In late June 2021, something shifted. The exact trigger remains unclear. Perhaps a bill arrived, or a phone call came through, or someone from the college reached out directly to his parents. Whatever the catalyst, the carefully constructed walls of Chandler's fantasy world began developing cracks. Bart and Krista started asking questions, real questions that required real answers. The vague responses that had worked before weren't cutting it anymore. They wanted proof. They wanted to see documentation. They wanted to understand why certain things weren't adding up. Chandler felt the walls closing in. For years, he had maintained control through manipulation and misdirection. But now his parents were demanding the one thing he couldn't provide: truth. We can only imagine the panic that must have gripped him as he realized the extent of his predicament. His entire identity as they knew it was built on nothing. When the lies collapsed, and they would collapse, he would be exposed not as the successful young man they believed in, but as someone who had spent years deceiving them, wasting their money, and disrespecting their trust. To most people facing such a reckoning, the options would be clear. Come clean, face the consequences, apologize, and try to rebuild. It would be humiliating, painful, and difficult, but it would be honest. It would be human. But Chandler Halderson wasn't thinking like most people. Something in his mind had twisted the problem into something else entirely. In his calculation, the solution to being discovered wasn't confession, it was elimination. During the first week of July, as summer heat settled over Wisconsin and families prepared for holiday celebrations, Chandler was preparing something else entirely. While his parents moved through their daily routines, completely unaware of the danger living under their own roof, their son was planning their murder. He researched, he calculated, he made decisions that would shatter multiple families and expose him as one of the most callous killers Wisconsin had seen in years. The young man who had spent so much energy maintaining a false image of success was about to reveal his true nature, and it was monstrous beyond anything his loving parents could have imagined. July 1st, 2021, was the last day anyone saw Bart and Krista Halderson alive. The date itself is deceptively ordinary. Summer was in full swing, the 4th of July weekend was approaching, and life in Windsor moved at its usual peaceful pace. But inside the Halderson home, something unspeakable was unfolding. While neighbors tended their gardens and planned barbecues, Chandler was executing the most horrific solution to his unraveling lies. The details of what happened inside that house are brutally chilling. According to evidence later presented in court, Chandler shot his father Bart first. The man who had worked hard his entire life to provide for his family, who believed in his son's potential and supported what he thought were his educational pursuits, was killed in his own home by the child he loved. The attack was sudden, efficient, and merciless. Bart likely never saw it coming. How could he? Parents don't expect their children to murder them. Krista's death followed, though the exact sequence of events would later be pieced together through forensic evidence and Chandler's own statements. The woman who had nurtured her son, who had celebrated his supposed achievements and encouraged his dreams, became his second victim. In a matter of hours, Chandler had transformed from a son into a double murderer, crossing a line that most human beings couldn't even conceive of crossing. But killing his parents was only the beginning of Chandler's horrific plan. What he did next reveals a level of depravity that still shocks investigators and prosecutors who worked the case. Rather than face what he'd done, rather than call for help or confess his crimes, Chandler began dismembering his parents' bodies. He used tools from the family garage to cut his mother and father into pieces, methodically working to destroy the physical evidence of his victims. The people who had given him life, raised him, and loved him unconditionally. The sheer psychological disconnect required to perform such acts is staggering. This wasn't a crime of sudden passion or uncontrolled rage. This was calculated, methodical, and sustained over hours. Chandler worked in the house he'd grown up in, surrounded by family photos and memories of birthday parties and Christmas mornings, dismembering the bodies of his parents. The horror of it defies comprehension. He transported body parts to different locations. Some he burned in a fireplace at his family's cabin in rural Wisconsin. Others he scattered in wooded areas, attempting to hide them where they might never be found. He cleaned the house, scrubbing away blood evidence and trying to eliminate any traces of the murders. And then, with his parents dead and their bodies destroyed, Chandler began the next phase of his plan, pretending everything was normal. On July 2nd, the day after the murders, Chandler reported his parents missing. He contacted Dane County Sheriff's Office with a story he'd carefully prepared. According to Chandler, his parents had left for their cabin up north and hadn't returned when expected. He expressed concern, playing the role of the worried son beautifully. Law enforcement had no reason to suspect him initially. Missing persons cases involving adults aren't uncommon, and Chandler seemed genuinely concerned about his parents' whereabouts. But Chandler's brother Mitchell wasn't buying it. Mitchell Halderson knew his parents' habits and routines. The story Chandler was telling didn't add up. His parents wouldn't just disappear without contacting anyone. They wouldn't miss important commitments or leave their responsibilities hanging. When Mitchell tried to reach his parents and got no response, when Chandler's explanation seemed vague and contradictory, alarm bells started ringing. Mitchell began asking questions, hard questions that Chandler struggled to answer consistently. As law enforcement began investigating the disappearance, Chandler continued his performance. He gave interviews. He provided information about his parents' last known activities. He acted confused and concerned about where they might be. To investigators initially reviewing the case, he appeared to be a devoted son desperate for his parents' safe return. But experienced detectives know that when someone goes missing, you start with the people closest to them. And they were watching Chandler very carefully. Chandler's girlfriend Kat was also becoming suspicious. The man she loved was acting strangely. His explanations about his parents' disappearance kept changing. Details that should have been simple became complicated. And there was something else. Something in Chandler's demeanor that felt off. A disconnect between the concerned son he was portraying and the almost casual way he seemed to be handling the situation. By July 7th, 6 days after Bart and Krista were last seen alive, the investigation had intensified dramatically. Deputies were following up on every lead, interviewing neighbors, checking surveillance footage, and building a timeline of the Haldersons' last known movements. And the more they investigated, the more one person kept emerging as their primary focus: Chandler. Then came the discovery that changed everything. On July 7th, a property owner in rural Dane County was clearing brush near the Yahara River when he found human remains. The discovery was reported immediately, and investigators rushed to the scene. What they found was horrifying: a torso, dismembered and partially concealed in the underbrush. The body parts were too decomposed for immediate visual identification, but forensic experts went to work analyzing the remains. 2 days later, on July 9th, a second gruesome discovery was made. Officers searching a different wooded area found additional human remains. The pieces of this puzzle were literally being found scattered across Wisconsin's landscape, and investigators knew with growing certainty what they were dealing with. Not a missing persons case, but a homicide investigation. The remains were sent for forensic analysis. DNA testing would take time, but investigators were already connecting the dots. The timing aligned with when Bart and Krista disappeared. The locations were within a reasonable distance from the Halderson home, and every piece of evidence kept pointing them back to the same person, the supposedly concerned son who had reported his parents missing. On July 8th, before the second set of remains was even discovered, detectives executed a search warrant on the Halderson home. What they found there would seal Chandler's fate. Despite his cleaning efforts, forensic specialists discovered blood evidence. Luminol testing revealed blood spatter patterns consistent with violent trauma. The house told a story that contradicted everything Chandler had been saying. They also searched the family's recreational property in Roxbury. There, investigators found evidence of recent fires in the fireplace. Fires hot enough and sustained enough to destroy organic material. Forensic analysis of the ash and debris would later reveal fragments of human bone. Chandler's carefully constructed lies, both about his education and career, and now about his parents' disappearance, were crumbling under the weight of physical evidence. But even as the walls closed in, he maintained his innocence, continuing to play the role of the confused and concerned son. He had no idea how much evidence was accumulating against him, or how close investigators were to understanding the full horror of what he'd done. Chandler Halderson was arrested on July 8, 2021, just 1 week after his parents vanished from their home. The charges initially filed were relatively minor: lying to investigators and obstructing the investigation into his parents' disappearance. But both Chandler and the authorities knew these charges were merely placeholders. The real accusations were coming, and they would be devastating. As forensic teams continued processing the Halderson home and analyzing the remains found in the woods, investigators began reconstructing the full scope of Chandler's deceptions. What they uncovered was a young man who had been living a completely fabricated existence for years, someone whose entire identity as his family knew it was built on elaborate lies. Detectives contacted Madison Area Technical College and discovered that Chandler hadn't been enrolled there in years. The insurance company where he claimed to work had no record of him whatsoever. The internship he'd described in such detail didn't exist. The professional references he'd mentioned were fictitious. Every single claim he'd made about his education and career was false. For years, while his parents believed he was building his future, Chandler had been doing nothing but maintaining an increasingly complex web of deception. But why? What drives someone to construct such an elaborate fantasy? Psychologists and criminologists who studied the case pointed to several possible factors. Some young adults, faced with the pressure of expectations they can't meet, retreat into fantasy rather than confronting their limitations. The shame of failure becomes so overwhelming that deception seems easier than honesty. Each lie necessitates another lie to support it, until the fabrication becomes so vast that maintaining it requires constant mental effort. For Chandler, the lies had become his entire existence. His identity as his parents and girlfriend knew him was completely fictional. When that fictional identity was threatened with exposure, he didn't see a path to redemption through honesty. He saw only catastrophic loss of everything he'd built. And so, in his twisted logic, eliminating the people who could expose him seemed like a solution. As July progressed, forensic results confirmed what investigators already suspected. DNA testing on the remains found near the Yahara River and in the woods matched Bart and Krista Halderson. The dismembered body parts scattered across Wisconsin belonged to Chandler's parents. Additional searches of the family's recreational property turned up more bone fragments in the fireplace ash. Chandler hadn't just killed his parents. He tried to erase them completely, burning and scattering their remains in a desperate attempt to destroy evidence. On July 14th, prosecutors filed formal charges: 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide, along with additional charges of mutilating a corpse, hiding a corpse, and providing false information about a missing person. If convicted on all counts, Chandler faced life in prison without the possibility of parole. The criminal complaint laid out the prosecution's theory of the crime in devastating detail. According to investigators, Chandler had shot his father in the back, killing him quickly. He then killed his mother, though the exact method was harder to determine due to the state of the remains. He had used tools from the family garage to dismember both bodies, working methodically to cut his parents into pieces small enough to transport and hide. The planning involved was chilling. Chandler had researched body disposal methods online. He'd identified multiple locations where he could scatter remains. He'd calculated what would burn and what wouldn't. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. It was premeditated murder followed by calculated destruction of evidence. As news of the charges spread, the community of Windsor reeled in shock. Neighbors who had known the Halderson family for years struggled to process what had happened. The quiet young man they'd seen coming and going from the house, the son who seemed so devoted to his parents, was actually a monster who had brutally murdered them. Parents everywhere felt a chill. If Bart and Krista Halderson, who seemed like loving and supportive parents, could be murdered by their own son, then where was anyone truly safe? Mitchell Halderson was left to grapple with an unimaginable reality. Not only had he lost both parents in the most horrific way possible, but his own brother was their killer. The family he'd grown up in had been destroyed in every possible way. In victim impact statements later shared during legal proceedings, Mitchell described the complete devastation of learning that his brother had murdered their parents and then lied about it, acting concerned while knowing exactly where their bodies were. Kat, Chandler's girlfriend, was also shattered by the revelations. The man she'd loved, the person she'd planned a future with, had been living a complete lie. Everything she thought she knew about him was false. And while she was building dreams about their life together, he was murdering his parents and dismembering their bodies. The psychological trauma of such a discovery is difficult to comprehend. As Chandler sat in jail awaiting trial, investigators continued building their case. They analyzed his internet search history and found chilling evidence of premeditation. In the weeks before the murders, Chandler had searched for information about body disposal, about how long it takes for bodies to decompose, about whether cadaver dogs could detect burned remains. He'd researched the family's recreational property, identifying it as a potential disposal site. He'd looked into his parents' schedules, determining when they'd be home and vulnerable. The prosecution team also discovered that Chandler had forged emails from his supposed employer, creating fake correspondence to show his parents when they asked questions about his job. He'd created fictitious characters, supervisors, professors, colleagues, all to support his elaborate lies. The effort required to maintain such deceptions over years was extraordinary, suggesting someone with significant intelligence who had chosen to use it for manipulation rather than achievement. Digital forensics experts analyzed Chandler's devices and found evidence he'd been accessing them from his parents' home even after reporting them missing, indicating he knew they weren't coming back. Security camera footage from neighbors showed Chandler making multiple trips to and from the house in the days after the murders, likely transporting body parts and cleaning up evidence. Perhaps most damning was Chandler's behavior during police interviews. Detectives noted his unusual lack of emotional response when discussing his missing parents. While he said the right words, expressing concern and confusion, his effect was flat, disconnected. Experienced investigators recognized that kind of dissonance. Innocent people desperate to find missing loved ones don't act calm and collected. They're frantic, emotional, desperate for information. Chandler's performance of concern rang false. By the time the case went to trial in January 2022, prosecutors had assembled an overwhelming mountain of evidence. They had forensic proof that Bart and Krista had been killed in their home. They had Chandler's internet search history showing premeditation. They had his demonstrable history of lying and fabrication. They had his suspicious behavior immediately after the murders. They had no evidence whatsoever of any other suspect. The defense faced a nearly impossible task: How do you defend someone against such overwhelming evidence? How do you explain away the internet searches, the forensic findings, the remains scattered across multiple locations, and the defendant's own documented history of extensive deception? Chandler had painted himself into a corner with his lies, and now that corner was a jail cell. The trial would determine whether he'd spend the rest of his life there. The trial of Chandler Halderson began on January 4, 2022, in the Dane County Circuit Court. The case had garnered significant media attention throughout Wisconsin and beyond. The story of a young man murdering and dismembering his parents because they were about to discover his lies was both fascinating and horrifying to the public. The courtroom was packed with media representatives, curious observers, and most importantly, members of the Halderson family seeking justice for Bart and Krista. Prosecutor William Brown laid out the state's case with methodical precision. Over the course of the trial, he presented the jury with a comprehensive narrative of Chandler's lies, his parents' growing suspicion, and the horrific solution he chose when faced with exposure. The evidence was presented piece by piece, building an inescapable picture of guilt. Forensic experts testified about the blood evidence found in the Halderson home. Despite Chandler's cleaning efforts, luminol testing had revealed extensive blood spatter consistent with violent trauma. DNA analysis confirmed the blood belonged to both Bart and Krista. The patterns indicated that at least one of the victims had been shot, causing significant blood spray across the room where they died. Investigators who had discovered the remains testified about the condition of the body parts when found. These testimonies were particularly difficult for family members to hear. Clinical descriptions of their loved ones reduced to scattered fragments hidden in the woods and burned in a fireplace. The brutality of what Chandler had done after killing his parents shocked even seasoned law enforcement officials. Digital forensics experts walked the jury through Chandler's internet search history. The searches painted a chilling picture of premeditation. How to dispose of a body? How long does it take for a body to decompose in water? Can cadaver dogs detect burned remains? Body found in Wisconsin. These searches had been conducted before his parents disappeared, proving that Chandler hadn't acted impulsively. He had planned their murders and researched how to hide the evidence. The prosecution also presented evidence of Chandler's elaborate web of lies about his education and career. College officials testified that he hadn't been enrolled in classes. Company representatives confirmed he'd never worked for them. Former classmates testified about Chandler dropping out years earlier. Every aspect of his supposed success was revealed as fiction. Prosecutors argued that when Bart and Krista began demanding proof of Chandler's claims, when they wanted to see transcripts, meet his supervisors, or attend his supposed graduation ceremony, Chandler realized his entire fabricated world was about to collapse. Rather than face the humiliation of his lies being exposed, rather than deal with his parents' disappointment and anger, he chose to eliminate them. The defense team, led by attorney Catherine Dorrell, faced an almost insurmountable challenge. The evidence against Chandler was overwhelming. Instead of claiming innocence, they attempted to argue that while Chandler had indeed killed his parents, the murders weren't premeditated. They were impulsive acts during confrontations about his lies. They tried to paint Chandler as someone who panicked rather than someone who coldly planned his parents' deaths. But the prosecution's evidence of premeditation was too strong. The internet searches alone demolished any claim of spontaneous violence. And Chandler's actions after the murders, the systematic dismemberment, the disposal of remains at multiple locations, the elaborate cover-up, all pointed to someone acting with calculation rather than panic. Perhaps most damaging to the defense was Chandler himself. Throughout the trial, he showed remarkably little emotion. When photographs of his parents were displayed, when testimony described their dismembered remains, when evidence of his lies was presented, Chandler's expression remained largely unchanged. Jurors could see the same disconnect that investigators had noted, a complete lack of appropriate emotional response. The defense chose not to put Chandler on the stand, recognizing that his testimony would likely do more harm than good. How could he explain his actions in a way that would generate sympathy? What could he possibly say that would mitigate the horror of what he'd done? Witness testimony from Mitchell Halderson was particularly powerful. Chandler's older brother described their parents as loving, supportive people who had always encouraged both their sons. He testified about how proud Bart and Krista were of what they believed were Chandler's accomplishments. He spoke about the family traditions, the holiday gatherings, the ordinary moments of family life that Chandler had destroyed forever. And he made clear that his parents would have forgiven Chandler for lying about school and work. They would have been disappointed, certainly, but they would have helped him figure out a path forward. They didn't deserve to die for wanting honesty from their son. Kat also testified, describing her relationship with Chandler and the lies he'd told her as well. She spoke about the person she thought she knew, charming, ambitious, caring, and how completely different that person was from the reality. She described her horror upon learning what Chandler had done while maintaining their relationship, while making plans for their future together, while acting like everything was normal. After 2 weeks of testimony, closing arguments began. Prosecutor Brown summarized the evidence systematically, walking jurors through every piece of proof that demonstrated Chandler's guilt. He emphasized the premeditation, the brutality, and the complete lack of remorse. He argued that Chandler had valued his lies more than his parents' lives, that he'd rather murder them than admit the truth about his failures. The defense's closing argument attempted to humanize Chandler, to portray him as someone who had made terrible mistakes compounded by panic. But the evidence made this narrative impossible to believe. On January 20th, 2022, after deliberating for just over 2 hours, the jury returned their verdict: guilty on all counts. Chandler Halderson was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide, mutilating a corpse, hiding a corpse, and providing false information about missing persons. The speed of the deliberation spoke volumes. The evidence was so overwhelming that jurors needed little time to reach their conclusion. At sentencing on March 17, 2022, family members delivered victim impact statements. Mitchell spoke about losing not only his parents but also his brother, about the destruction of his entire family. He described holidays that would never be celebrated, grandchildren his parents would never meet, and the permanent hole left in his life by their murders. Other family members and friends spoke about Bart and Krista, who they were as people, what they meant to their community, and the senseless waste of their deaths. They described a couple who had worked hard, loved deeply, and deserved to enjoy their retirement years together. Instead, they'd been brutally murdered by the son they'd sacrificed so much to raise. When given the opportunity to speak, Chandler offered no apology, no explanation, no expression of remorse. His silence spoke as loudly as any words could have. Judge John Hyland sentenced Chandler to life in prison without the possibility of parole on each count of first-degree intentional homicide, to be served consecutively. Additional sentences on the other charges ensured that Chandler would never walk free again. At 23 years old, he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. In his sentencing remarks, Judge Hyland described the crimes as among the most disturbing he'd encountered in his career. He noted the premeditation, the brutality, and Chandler's complete lack of remorse. He emphasized that Chandler had betrayed the most fundamental bonds of human society, the bonds between parent and child, in the most horrific way imaginable. The Chandler Halderson case serves as a dark reminder of how deception can metastasize into something monstrous. What began as lies about college and work escalated into a web of fabrications so complex that Chandler believed murder was preferable to exposure. The case also highlights how danger can lurk in the most unexpected places. Bart and Krista Halderson never imagined their own son could harm them, let alone murder and dismember them. For the community of Windsor and for everyone who followed the case, questions linger. How does someone become so divorced from empathy and morality that they can kill their own parents? What warning signs might have been missed? Could anything have prevented this tragedy? Mental health professionals who studied the case pointed to Chandler's pathological lying, his lack of emotional response, and his complete inability to take responsibility for his actions as indicators of serious psychological dysfunction. But many people lie and very few escalate to murder. What made Chandler cross that line remains disturbing and not fully understood. Today, Chandler Halderson sits in a Wisconsin prison cell, where he will remain for the rest of his life. Mitchell Halderson and other family members continue to grieve, trying to rebuild lives shattered by unimaginable loss. And somewhere in Windsor, the house where Bart and Krista Halderson were murdered stands as a quiet monument to a family destroyed from within. The monster Chandler Halderson wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was hiding behind a carefully constructed mask of normalcy, living under his parents' roof, sharing their meals, accepting their love and support while planning their destruction. And when that mask finally slipped, it revealed something darker than anyone could have imagined. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The Devil in the Daylight. The Richard Chase story. A child's laughter dies mid-breath, replaced by silence so absolute it screams. What stands at your doorway doesn't knock. It's already deciding which of you dies first. We're tracking something that shouldn't exist outside nightmares. A predator so consumed by delusion that reality itself bent around his madness, turning suburban streets into hunting grounds where locked doors meant nothing and sunlight offered no sanctuary. Richard Chase didn't just cross the line between human and monster. He obliterated it, leaving a trail so disturbing that seasoned homicide detectives would wake screaming for years. This is the story of the Vampire of Sacramento, and how an entire city learned that evil doesn't always hide in shadows. Sacramento, California, 1978. The new year arrived with clear skies and cold mornings, the kind of weather that makes people grateful for warm homes and locked doors. Families prepared for normal lives. School runs, grocery shopping, weekend plans. Nobody realized they were living alongside something that had already stopped being human. Richard Trenton Chase grew up in an ordinary house on an ordinary street, but inside his skull, reality was already fracturing. His childhood seemed unremarkable to neighbors. A quiet boy, perhaps too quiet, with eyes that never quite focused on what everyone else was seeing. But behind those eyes, something was assembling itself, piece by twisted piece. By his teenage years, the cracks were showing. Chase became obsessed with his own body, convinced his heart was shrinking, that his skull bones were separating, that someone had stolen his pulmonary artery. He would hold oranges against his head, believing vitamin C would absorb through his skull directly into his brain. His mother found him countless times, standing naked in the backyard, staring at the sun for hours, mumbling about bones and blood and things trying to escape through his skin. The delusions metastasized. He killed animals, cats, dogs, rabbits, not for cruelty's sake, but because the voices in his head screamed that he needed their blood to survive. His own blood was turning to powder, they told him. His heart was stopping. Only blood, fresh, warm, pumping blood, could keep him alive. He would capture animals, kill them, and drink. Sometimes he ate the organs raw, convinced they contained essential elements his body was losing. Psychiatric hospitals became revolving doors. Doctors diagnosed paranoid schizophrenia, prescribed medications, watched him improve, then released him. Each time, Chase would stop taking his pills the moment he walked free. The voices were his reality. The medications were the delusion, trying to kill him by weakening his defenses. His mother, desperate and terrified, tried everything. His father, worn down by years of chaos, eventually gave up. They separated partly because of the strain of raising something neither could understand or control. Chase moved into his own apartment, a decision that would sign death warrants for people who'd never heard his name. Alone in his apartment, Chase's world became a laboratory of madness. The walls were smeared with blood. Dead animals in various states of decay littered every surface. He kept a blender on the kitchen counter, filled with a mixture he called his health shake. Coca-Cola and blood, sometimes with organs thrown in, sometimes just the liquid he'd drained from whatever creature he'd caught that day. The smell was indescribable, a thick, sweet rot that neighbors complained about but nobody investigated. He believed Nazis were after him, that they'd planted monitoring devices under his soap dish, that his mother was trying to poison him in collaboration with Jewish mafia bosses. These weren't metaphors or exaggerations to Chase. They were absolute, undeniable facts, as real as the floor beneath his feet. And the only thing keeping the Nazis from killing him was blood. Fresh blood. Human blood. The transition from animals to humans wasn't a leap for Chase. It was an inevitability, a logical progression in his fractured mind. Animals weren't providing enough of whatever he believed he needed. The voices were getting louder, more demanding, more insistent that his death was imminent unless he took drastic action. December 29, 1977, marked the end of any remaining humanity. Chase attempted to enter several homes in his neighborhood, testing doors and windows. Most were locked, which he interpreted as a sign. Locked doors meant he wasn't welcome, that the residents were protected, that he should move on. But unlocked doors? Those were invitations, permissions, cosmic signals that he was meant to enter. He found an unlocked house and walked through it, looking for victims. The family was out. He defecated on their bed, a territorial marking investigators would later theorize, or perhaps another symptom of his complete psychological disintegration. Then he left, unsatisfied but patient. The real hunting hadn't begun yet. 2 days later, on December 31st, Chase was ready. He saw Ambrose Griffin, a 51-year-old engineer and father, helping his wife carry groceries from their car. Chase had a .22 caliber pistol. His mother had helped him purchase it, hoping it would make him feel safe, never imagining what it would be used for. As Griffin's wife went inside, Chase approached. No words, no confrontation, no warning. He simply raised the gun and fired 2 shots into Griffin's chest at point-blank range. Griffin collapsed in his driveway, bleeding out on the cold concrete while his wife screamed from inside the house. Chase stood over him for a moment, watching the blood pool and spread, then walked away. He didn't take anything. He didn't need to. He'd confirmed something crucial. Killing humans was easy. The blood was flowing, and nobody could stop him. That murder should have been the end, the moment police descended and locked him away forever. But this was before modern surveillance, before neighborhood watch apps, before Ring doorbells. Chase was just another face in Sacramento, and Griffin's murder, while tragic, seemed like a robbery gone wrong or a random act of violence. Police had no suspects, no leads, no reason to think this was the beginning of something worse. Chase returned to his apartment, exhilarated and terrified in equal measure. The voices were temporarily satisfied, but he knew, with the absolute certainty that only the insane possess, that he would need to kill again. Soon, the powder was still spreading through his veins. His heart was still shrinking. The Nazis were still closing in. And next time, he wouldn't just kill. Next time, he would take what he needed. Next time, there would be blood. January 23, 1978, began as an ordinary Monday. Teresa Wallen, 22 years old and 3 months pregnant, was home alone in her quiet suburban neighborhood. Her husband David had left for work early, kissing her goodbye, promising to be home for dinner. Teresa had the day off and planned to relax, maybe do some light cleaning, think about the baby growing inside her and the future they were building together. She had no idea that her future had approximately 90 minutes left. Richard Chase woke that morning with an intensity that terrified even him. The voices were screaming now, not just whispering. His blood had turned completely to powder overnight, they told him. His heart had stopped 3 times while he slept. He was technically dead already, a walking corpse sustained only by force of will. He needed blood immediately, or he would collapse into dust. He loaded his .22 pistol, grabbed a knife from his kitchen, crusted with old blood and filth, and left his apartment. He wasn't hunting for a specific person. He was hunting for an unlocked door, a cosmic invitation, a sign from the universe that someone had been selected as his salvation. He tried multiple houses. Locked, locked, locked. Each locked door was a rejection, proof that he wasn't meant to enter, that those people were protected by invisible forces he couldn't overcome. His desperation grew with each failure. The sun was climbing higher, people were waking up, his window of opportunity was closing. Then he found Teresa Wallen's house. The door was unlocked. David had forgotten to lock it when he left that morning, a simple mistake that would haunt him for the rest of his life. To Chase, this wasn't a mistake. This was destiny. This was permission. This was an invitation written in the fabric of reality itself. He opened the door and stepped inside. Teresa was in the living room, probably heard the door open, probably called out thinking David had forgotten something and come back home. She walked toward the entryway, expecting her husband's familiar face. Instead, she saw a stranger, unwashed, wild-eyed, holding a gun. The shot hit her in the hand first as she raised it defensively. The second shot struck her head, killing her almost instantly. She collapsed, and Chase stood over her body, watching blood spread across the carpet. But death wasn't enough this time. Death was just the beginning. What happened next in that house defies human comprehension. Chase dragged Teresa's body to the bedroom, removed her clothes, and began his work. He stabbed her repeatedly, each thrust of the knife precise and purposeful. He cut open her abdomen, reached inside and removed organs, the liver, kidneys, intestines, examining each one with the focused intensity of a surgeon or a butcher. He sliced open her stomach and collected blood in a yogurt cup he found in the kitchen. He drank directly from her wounds, pressing his mouth against the incisions, swallowing mouthfuls of blood that he believed would reconstitute his own disintegrating circulatory system. He smeared blood across the walls, the floor, the furniture, marking territory, celebrating ritual, or simply acting out the incomprehensible demands of his fractured psyche. He found dog feces in the backyard and brought it inside, placing it in Teresa's mouth. Another inexplicable act that profilers would later struggle to interpret. Dominance, degradation, or just another symptom of complete psychological collapse, where every action is disconnected from meaning or motive. The entire assault lasted perhaps 30 minutes. When Chase finally left, Teresa's body was barely recognizable as human. The bedroom looked like an abattoir, blood coating every surface, the smell of death already settling into the walls and carpet. He walked out the front door, still carrying some of her organs in his pockets, blood soaking through his clothes, and simply drove away. David Wallen came home that evening expecting dinner and conversation. Instead, he found his wife's mutilated body and a crime scene so horrific that the first responding officers vomited in the front yard. Hardened homicide detectives who'd worked hundreds of murders stood in that bedroom and cried. The forensic photographer had to leave twice to compose himself. The medical examiner's report was clinical and precise, describing each wound, each missing organ, each violation. But between the lines, you could sense the examiner's horror, the realization that this wasn't just murder. This was something else entirely, something that existed in a category beyond normal human evil. Sacramento Police Department went into overdrive. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a domestic dispute. This was a predator, organized enough to enter a home and escape without witnesses, but disorganized enough to leave behind a scene of absolute chaos. The FBI was called in immediately. Profilers began constructing a picture of the killer. Male, likely mid-20s, severe mental illness, probably living alone, definitely escalating. News of Teresa's murder spread through Sacramento like wildfire. Suddenly, every unlocked door became a potential death sentence. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts within hours. Neighbors who'd never spoken suddenly formed watch groups. Parents stopped letting children play outside unsupervised. The entire city held its breath, waiting for the next attack. They didn't have to wait long. Chase was unsatisfied. The blood had helped temporarily, but the voices were already returning, louder than before. Teresa's organs were rotting in his apartment, but they weren't providing the sustenance he needed. His heart was still shrinking. His blood was still turning to powder. The Nazis were closer than ever, and he knew with absolute delusional certainty that he needed more. Much more. January 27, 1978. For days after Teresa Wallen's murder, Sacramento was a city on edge, parents clutching children closer, doors locked and double-checked, but still clinging to the desperate hope that the killing was over, that the monster had moved on or been satisfied or somehow disappeared back into whatever hell had spawned him. Richard Chase had other plans. The voices were relentless now, a constant screaming inside his skull that drowned out everything else. His apartment had become a shrine to madness. Blood-smeared walls, rotting organs, the blender still full of his nauseating mixture, animal carcasses in various states of decay. He needed more blood, not just any blood. He needed a quantity sufficient to completely replace his own circulatory system, to flush out the powder, to rebuild himself from the inside out. He drove through Sacramento neighborhoods with methodical focus, testing doors, looking for the cosmic invitation. House after house, locked, locked, locked. Each rejection made the voices scream louder. Time was running out. The Nazis were closing in. His heart had maybe hours left before it stopped completely. Then he found it. 2360 Tioga Way, a modest home in a quiet neighborhood. The front door was unlocked. Permission granted. Invitation accepted. Destiny fulfilled. Chase entered and immediately knew this house was different. He heard voices, real ones, not the ones in his head. A woman, children, multiple victims, multiple sources of blood. This was exactly what the voices had been demanding. Evelyn Miroth, 38 years old, was babysitting her 22-month-old nephew, David Ferreira, while also caring for her own 6-year-old son, Jason. Her friend Danny Meredith, 51, had stopped by to visit. It was early afternoon, the kind of peaceful domestic scene that happens in homes across America every day. Adults chatting, children playing, nobody aware that death had just walked through the front door. Chase moved through the house with the gun raised. Danny Meredith saw him first, this wild-eyed stranger holding a weapon, and probably had just enough time to realize what was happening before Chase fired. The bullet struck Meredith in the head, killing him instantly. His body crumpled in the hallway, blood spreading across the floor. Jason Miroth heard the gunshot and came running to see what happened. He saw the stranger, saw Danny's body, and his 6-year-old mind couldn't process what his eyes were showing him. Chase turned and fired. Jason fell beside Danny, shot in the head at point-blank range, his small body collapsing like a puppet with cut strings. Evelyn heard the shots and ran toward the bathroom, carrying baby David, some maternal instinct telling her to hide, to protect the child in her arms. But there was nowhere to go, no escape, no salvation. Chase followed, methodical and unhurried. He found her in the bathroom, cornered and terrified, holding the baby like a shield. He shot her multiple times, the bullets tearing through her body until she collapsed into the bathtub, still clutching David. The baby was screaming now, that particular pitch of infant terror that cuts through everything else. Chase looked at the child, and whatever calculations happened in his fractured mind, the conclusion was inevitable. He shot the baby in the head, 22 months old, still in diapers. The screaming stopped. The house fell silent except for Chase's breathing and the dripping of blood, for people dead in under 3 minutes. But Chase wasn't done. Death was never the point, blood was the point, and there was blood everywhere now, fresh and flowing and exactly what the voices demanded. He dragged Evelyn's body from the bathtub to the bedroom. What he did to her corpse mirrored and exceeded what he'd done to Teresa Wallen. He stabbed her repeatedly, opened her abdomen, removed organs with the focused intensity of someone following specific instructions. He drank from her wounds, filled containers with her blood, smeared it across his face and body like war paint. Then he did something that would haunt investigators for decades. He took baby David's body, placed it in a box, and decapitated it. He removed the child's organs, including the brain, which he took with him. Later examination of Chase's apartment would reveal evidence that he'd consumed parts of the baby's brain, either raw or mixed into his horrific blender concoctions. The savagery was beyond comprehension. The medical examiner would later testify that in 30 years of examining murder victims, he'd never seen anything approaching this level of violation. Evelyn's body had been mutilated so extensively that identifying all the injuries took days. The baby had been literally taken apart, piece by piece, like a predator consuming prey. Chase left the house carrying organs and blood, his clothes soaked crimson, walking back to his car in broad daylight. A neighbor, seeing him leave, noticed the blood but assumed he'd been in an accident or was helping someone who was injured. The human mind resists accepting that a person covered in blood might be a mass murderer. Surely there's some rational explanation, some innocent reason. By the time the neighbor thought to call police, Chase was gone. It was Evelyn's older son who discovered the bodies. He came home from school that afternoon, walked through the front door calling for his mother, and found a scene that would destroy his childhood and probably haunt him until his last breath. For people he loved, butchered and violated, blood everywhere. The house transformed into a slaughterhouse. His screams brought neighbors running. Police arrived within minutes. Even veteran officers, men who'd seen suicides and car accidents and domestic murders, stood in that house and felt their sanity strain at the edges. This wasn't just evil, this was something beyond evil, something that shouldn't exist in a civilized world. The FBI profilers updated their assessment immediately. The killer was escalating rapidly, becoming bolder, taking more risks. The 4-day gap between murders suggested he might strike again within days or even hours. Sacramento wasn't just home to a serial killer. It was home to something worse, something driven by compulsion so powerful that consequences didn't register, that the normal human fear of capture or punishment had been completely overridden. Every law enforcement officer in Sacramento was mobilized. Roadblocks went up. Helicopters circled neighborhoods. The National Guard was put on standby. Parents pulled children from schools. Grocery stores emptied as people stocked up, preparing to barricade themselves inside their homes until this nightmare ended. But Chase wasn't hiding. He was in his apartment, surrounded by his trophies, organs in the refrigerator, blood in containers, the baby's brain in a plastic bag. Feeling temporarily satisfied but knowing the voices would return soon, demanding more, always more, an endless hunger that could never truly be satisfied. The investigation moved with desperate urgency. 6 people dead in less than a month, murdered with a savagery that suggested the killer was completely detached from reality. Sacramento police worked around the clock, following leads, interviewing witnesses, analyzing evidence. The break they needed came from an unexpected direction. Chase's own unraveling mind. He'd left evidence everywhere, because in his delusion, he didn't believe he was doing anything wrong. He was saving his own life, following cosmic instructions, surviving against the forces trying to kill him. The idea that this might be illegal or that he might be caught never fully registered. Consequence existed in a different reality than the one he inhabited. A witness came forward who'd seen Chase leaving Evelyn Myertha's house, blood-soaked and carrying a box. The description was detailed enough for police to create a sketch. Another witness remembered seeing a car matching his vehicle description near Teresa Wallen's house. The net was tightening, but Chase remained oblivious, going about his daily routines, shopping for groceries, buying dog food for animals he'd already killed and consumed. Former classmates saw the police sketch on television and called with the same name, Richard Chase. Police checked records and found the psychiatric history, the animal cruelty complaints, the previous disturbing incidents. Everything clicked into place with horrifying clarity. They had their monster. Now they just needed to catch him before he killed again. January 28, 1978, the day after the Miroth family massacre, police surrounded Chase's apartment. They expected resistance, perhaps a shootout or a hostage situation. Instead, Chase answered the door wearing nothing but a t-shirt, covered in dried blood, looking confused about why police would be interested in him. "I'm just trying to survive," he told them, as if this explained everything. "The Nazis are trying to kill me. I need blood to live." Officers entered the apartment and found themselves in hell's waiting room. Blood smeared on every wall, some from animals, some human. The refrigerator contained human organs in Tupperware containers labeled by type: liver, kidney, brain. The blender still contained its nightmarish mixture. Dead animals in various states of decay filled the bathroom. The smell was so overwhelming that several officers had to leave to vomit. In Chase's closet, they found bloody clothing, including pants soaked with Teresa Wallen's blood and a jacket stained with blood from the Miroth family. Under his bed, they discovered baby David Ferreira's organs in plastic bags. The .22 pistol was hidden in a drawer, along with notebooks filled with ramblings about Nazis and poison soap and the cosmic necessity of consuming blood. Chase confessed immediately and without apparent guilt. He described each murder in clinical detail, explaining his reasoning with the earnest conviction of someone describing perfectly logical behavior. He'd killed these people because he needed their blood to survive. They'd left their doors unlocked, which was permission. The universe had selected them as his salvation. How could anyone possibly object to him trying to save his own life? Psychiatrists evaluated him and confirmed what everyone already knew: paranoid schizophrenia so severe that he lived in an entirely different reality than everyone else. But the legal question wasn't whether he was insane. It was whether he understood that his actions were wrong. And on this point, the evidence was mixed. Chase knew society disapproved of murder, but in his delusional framework, society's rules didn't apply to life or death situations. If someone was drowning and stole a boat to save themselves, would that be theft? In Chase's mind, he was drowning in powdered blood, and these victims were his lifeboat. The trial was a media spectacle. Cameras weren't allowed in courtrooms then, but reporters filled every seat, describing each day's testimony in lurid detail. The evidence was overwhelming and horrific. Autopsy reports, crime scene photographs so disturbing that jurors wept openly. Psychiatric testimony attempting to make sense of the senseless. The defense argued insanity, not as a legal technicality but as an obvious reality. Their client lived in a different universe where Nazis were real threats, where blood turned to powder, where unlocked doors were cosmic invitations. How could someone this detached from reality be held to normal standards of criminal responsibility? The prosecution countered with evidence of planning and consciousness of wrongdoing. Chase had hidden evidence. He'd fled crime scenes. He'd understood enough about social norms to know that what he was doing would be perceived as wrong, even if he believed it was necessary. Insane didn't mean innocent. It meant dangerous, irredeemable, and in need of permanent containment. The jury deliberated for 5 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty on 6 counts of first-degree murder. The recommendation: death penalty. Chase showed no reaction, his eyes still focused on something nobody else could see, his mind still processing reality through filters that had nothing to do with the courtroom around him. During the penalty phase, details of his psychiatric history emerged. The years of missed interventions, the system that had cycled him through hospitals and back onto streets where he had access to weapons and victims. His mother testified, weeping, describing the son she'd lost to schizophrenia long before he'd killed anyone. The gradual transformation from troubled child to something unrecognizable. But sympathy had limits, especially for parents of dead children. Jason Myrath's father spoke about his 6-year-old son, who'd loved dinosaurs and drawing, whose life had been erased by a madman's delusion. Baby David's parents described their child's first words, first steps, the future that had been stolen. Teresa Wallen's husband spoke about the baby they'd never meet, the life they'd planned, the hole in reality where his wife used to be. The judge sentenced Chase to death. He was transported to San Quentin State Prison, where he joined death row's collection of California's worst killers. Guards reported that other inmates hated him. Even murderers and rapists found Chase repulsive, a monster beyond their comprehension. He spent 23 hours a day in isolation, alone with the voices that had driven him to kill. But Richard Chase wouldn't wait for California's lengthy execution process. On December 26, 1980, nearly 3 years after his arrest, he saved up his prescribed antidepressants for several weeks, then took them all at once. Guards found him dead in his cell, finally escaping the Nazis and the powder and the shrinking heart that had never actually existed outside his fractured mind. He was 30 years old. His 6 victims ranged from 22 months to 51 years. The trauma he inflicted rippled outward through families, neighborhoods, an entire city that learned that monsters don't always look like monsters, that evil can wear a confused expression and genuinely believe it's the victim, that the line between human and inhuman is thinner than anyone wants to believe. Sacramento eventually moved on, but the scars remained. The homes where Chase killed were eventually sold, though sellers were required to disclose their history. Families moved in, moved out, trying to live normal lives in spaces where normal had been violated beyond repair. The case became a staple of criminal psychology classes, FBI training seminars, true crime documentaries, a perfect storm of mental illness, system failure, and human vulnerability. The question that haunts investigators and psychiatrists even now: could this have been prevented? The answer is complicated and uncomfortable. Chase's schizophrenia was diagnosed years before he killed anyone. He'd been hospitalized, medicated, observed. But the system released him repeatedly, either because he seemed stable on medication or because facilities were overcrowded or because commitment laws prioritized individual liberty over preventive detention. Even if every intervention had been perfect, even if he'd been kept hospitalized, even if his parents had fought harder, would it have mattered? The voices in Chase's head were real to him, more real than doctors or medications or locked doors. His reality was fundamentally incompatible with the shared reality the rest of us inhabit. And once he decided that human blood was the only thing keeping him alive, only physical restraint could have stopped him. The Vampire of Sacramento remains one of the most disturbing cases in American criminal history, not because of the body count. Other killers have murdered more, but because of the absolute disconnect between Chase's internal logic and external reality. He wasn't sadistic, he was trying to survive. He wasn't evil, he was insane. And somehow that makes it worse. Evil can be understood, opposed, contained. But this was something else entirely. A reminder that human consciousness is fragile, that reality is more subjective than we want to believe, and that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones who never chose to become monsters at all. The doors in Sacramento are locked now, always locked, a permanent legacy of one man's delusion and the 6 innocent people who paid the price. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.